So you're just really bringing the scale of these soft drink companies to a much easier to manufacture product, because all they do to manufacture it is open the faucet on a municipal tap.
Welcome to Go No Go. My name's John Brunner. Go No Go is a podcast about design, engineering, manufacturing, and the decisions that can make or break great products. It's brought to you by Lumafield, which makes industrial CT scanners and analysis software that help engineers and product creators develop and deliver great products faster than ever. On today's episode of the podcast, we'll be talking about plastic packaging from a few different angles, talking about the evolution of the plastic bottle with Spencer Wright, who's just written a new article about it that's published on First Article, and talking about the legendary Tylenol murders and what it meant for the evolution of pharmaceutical packaging. Today we're joined by Spencer Wright. He's a writer, engineer, and creator who's behind Scope of Work, which is an incredibly thoughtful newsletter about how things get made. He recently published an essay on First Article about the evolution of the plastic bottle, looking at the history of one of the most ordinary objects in our lives, which is also an extraordinary object. Spencer, it's great to have you on.
Thanks so much for having me, John.
So your work focuses a lot on kind of ordinary objects that have interesting stories. Had you thought a lot about plastic bottles before now?
A bit. I spend a lot of time on a bike, and so I end up using kind of the standard bicycle water bottle for most of my hydration needs. But have recently kind of become aware that folks who do kind of ultra lightweight hiking and cycling use water bottles that you buy at the corner store, right? Which strikes me as just this really creative way of repurposing kind of an everyday object for kind of high performance requirements. I think it's a totally fascinating object.
Let's talk a little bit about the history. When did the plastic bottle appear?
So we first start seeing plastic bottles in the 1970s. This was a time when Coke and Pepsi are battling it out in the soft drink market. At the time, both of those companies outsourced their bottling to other companies, to bottlers. And they were producing most of their soft drinks in glass bottles. Plastic bottles and aluminum both kind of come into the market around the same time. So the patents are kind of happening in the late 60s, and then the introduction is happening in the early to mid 70s.
I had no idea that aluminum cans were about the same age as the plastic bottle. I guess before that it was the tin can, but drinks weren't packaged in cans.
Right. There was steel cans, right? I guess. But and I'm forgetting the date, but I think that we still had those pull tabs on our beer cans, I think into the 1970s or so. And it was kind of around the time that plastic bottles were introduced that canners started switching over to the kind of more modern integrated, I guess it's a two-piece design that we have now, where the opener is kind of captive on the top of the can, and you push the opener pushes the hole into the lid, and then remains attached. But before I think kind of the 1970s, you would rip that, you would kind of peel the thing off, and then usually throw it on the ground or something like that, because we had kind of different practices then. Right.
And who got to the plastic bottle first?
So Coca-Cola seems to have been the first company to really introduce a plastic bottle for soda. They used acrylonitrile copolymer, which was developed by Monsanto. They were very, very excited about this. There's kind of a glitzy press release and introduction at in a hotel somewhere. But there were some issues with it. It was only in the market for a couple of years.
What happened?
So it turns out acrylonitrile copolymer is this material that you can You can shape it, you can mold it, you can stretch it, but it then leaches into whatever you put in it. And I don't know if there were ever any human trials, but they did realize that animals that were fed large amounts of acrylonitrile had a whole bunch of health effects. And so the FDA pulled this material for direct contact with food in 1977. So the bottle was introduced in 75, but it was only on the market for a couple of years before it was pulled.
I'm holding one of these bottles now. It's a Coca-Cola bottle. It says easy goer, lightweight plastic, no deposit, 32 ounces. It's 50 years old. It's from 1975. It's a little green. And the plastic is very rigid. I can't tell if it's because it's a lot thicker than a modern plastic bottle or more rigid plastic.
Yeah, way, way thicker, right? It's like 2 or 3 times the thickness of at least the lightweight water bottles that you use once and then throw into the garbage.
Right.
Yeah.
The other notable thing is that it has a metal cap.
Right. Yeah, I was pretty interested in that. I mean, I guess it's more a comment on our perspective today that we just think of plastic as being the default material for this stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
You make a plastic bottle with a plastic lid. But back then, Coke is still coming, they're still living in an era where a lot of their products are packaged in glass with a metal lid. And so when they went to a plastic bottle, they have that metal lid as well.
That felt like a natural move for them. It feels like it would be harder to make, a multi-material package like this than a single material package.
Right, that's what I would think as well. But I guess if you already have, manufacturers who are making these metal lids, then it's a bit easier. And even today, the manufacturing processes for bottles and lids are fairly distinct, and there are different manufacturers that make those two things. So maybe it's not as easy today to make a single material bottle as we imagine it would be.
Interesting. Everything is more complex than you think. So this is acrylonitrile. Where did the manufacturers go from here?
Like I said, the acrylonitrile was only on the market for a couple of years before it was pulled. And while Monsanto was developing these acrylonitrile bottles, there was a whole different team at DuPont who originally they were working on polypropylene, or they were interested in polypropylene at least, but they switched over to PET, right? So this is polyethylene. They had gotten patents for PET bottles in I think it was 1973 or so. And it was only a year or two after the acrylonitrile was pulled that the first PET bottles entered the market.
So I'm holding one of those now. It is a 2-liter bottle, whereas the acrylonitrile bottle that I have is just a quart. But the 2-liter bottle is about the same weight as the 1-quart bottle.
Yeah, it's incredible. Yeah. And it has this glued on base too, right? This is it's actually like a 3 or 4 part assembly depending on how you count, right? You have
that's right. It still has a metal cap, smaller throat, but yeah, tell me about this base. This glued on black plastic base is something that I remember from pizza parties as a child.
Right. So basically, you have to imagine that these things are pressure vessels, right? They have a bunch of carbon dioxide gas dissolved in the liquids they contain, and the entire thing exerts pressure on the walls of the bottle. Now, the most efficient way to handle that pressure is to make the thing kind of as close to a sphere as you possibly can. And if you look inside that bottle, you'll notice that the clear PET base is a hemisphere on its bottom.
That's right.
Because hemispheres are really, really good at distributing loads evenly, right? You have kind of an even amount of tension at any given point on a spherical shape.
That's right, but it won't stand up, will it?
It won't stand up, exactly. And so you have this separate part, this opaque black plastic base that is glued on to the bottom of this bottle such that it will stand up. And they were made that way for something like 20 years before the sort of companies eventually figured out how to make bases that would both stand up and withstand the tension caused by their pressure inside, and not rupture, right, when they're dropped or something like that.
Yeah. So when did this design finally disappear with the second piece on the base?
I mean, it was well into my childhood, right? These two-piece or these multi-piece bottles, these 2-liter bottles, were on the market until the 90s. So you have both the kind of new Coke a product was packaged in that, as well as Crystal Pepsi as well. And if you look in, John Hughes movies from the early 90s, you'll see these two-part bottles kind of ostentatiously displayed in
a little bit of product
placement.
were
lucrative product placement deals. Yeah.
Well, and now we have an example of a modern Coke bottle, another 2-liter bottle. First of all, when you hold it again, this bottle is much, much lighter than the, perhaps 35 or so year old bottle that I have in my left hand. And this has the familiar 5-lobe design on the bottom. How did they make this work? What was the technical breakthrough that made it possible to shape the bottle so that it could both withstand its internal pressure and stand up on a table?
Right. So this is a petaloid base, right? The soda bottles, I think, usually have 5. I have an Evian bottle here that it's not quite petaloid, but it has this kind of similar kind of ridged structure on its base. And obviously, the Evian bottle is not pressurized, so it's not trying to withstand quite as much force. But these petaloid bases are really, really good at distributing. Basically, you want to distribute the load evenly across the structure such that you don't have any stress risers or anything like that. And so these petaloid bases, they have, fair curves everywhere, right? And there's just something about them where they're able to resist the internal pressure of the soda, and they stand up nicely. And if you drop them, they won't break either, right? They're quite strong. And yeah, as you said, I mean, this, modern 2-liter bottles are roughly half the weight of these multi-part bottles with the opaque base.
This is something we see in among a lot of our customers who make consumer packaging, is that they're under a great deal of pressure to remove plastic from packaging or to reduce its usage. And the number one thing that you can do before you get into more exotic, like biodegradable resins or recyclable plastics, is just reduce the thickness of the bottle. And so introducing these types of design features, or you have other little ridges that are indented into this bottle, as well as the petaloid on the base. It's a really clever solution to give it more rigidity while removing material, dematerializing.
Yeah, they're quite clever. I mean, you'll notice that most of the modern bottles on the market, their walls are not perfectly straight. And so you have little bulges at the bottom and at the top typically. And the modern Coke bottle that you have there obviously has the kind of traditional hourglass shape, which kind of emphasizes that. But regardless, they're trying to reduce their mass in really significant ways. And they have to think about the entire life cycle of this product, from when it's, from when the liquid is put into the bottle to when I open it out of my fridge, right? And there are multiple steps in there that you really can't control at all. I mean, you can demand that your bottlers follow certain procedures, but then your bottler is just going to put it on some truck, right?
Yeah.
And the guy who drives that truck and the guy who loads it onto a handcart and then dumps it onto the sidewalk in front of a grocery store or a convenience store, I mean, you have just no control whatsoever about how careful that person is. And so there are some really, really intelligent features built into these things to make them as absolutely light as possible, while still kind of being able to handle the rough handling of their process.
This is probably one of the most resilient objects in our daily life. If you compare it to something that, is more outwardly presented as ruggedized, like an SUV or something, the envelope of environments that a plastic bottle can survive in is much wider than the envelope of environments that a premium rugged SUV can survive in.
Yeah, it's really remarkable. I mean, you just go, I live in New York City. I can go out and find, so many different places where these things are sold, and each of them has their own little constraints and their own little risks and so on and so forth. And somehow these bottles survive in all of them.
So I'm going to push these Coke bottles over to the side and reach behind me to get a couple more bottles. We also have some water bottles here. And you talked a bit about the evolution of bottled water in your essay as well. First up, this Aquafina bottle. What's interesting about this?
I mean, partly to me, what's interesting to that is that they ditched the high fructose corn syrup, right? I mean, they realized they convinced the Coca-Cola company convinced us to buy a lot of liquids that are packaged in plastic. But as we got into the late 90s and early aughts, people started buying less soda. And so Aquafina is introduced by Pepsi in, I think, 1993 or so, something like that, 94. And then Coke launches Dasani in 99. And, from there, this is where you really find like staggering quantities of plastic bottles on the market, right? You have vending machines that are stocked with Coke products that contain high fructose corn syrup. And then right next to them, there's a vending machine that only has bottled water, and it's stocked by the same person in the same truck, right? Mm-hmm. And so you're just really bringing the scale of these soft drink companies to a much easier to manufacture product, because all they do to manufacture it is open the faucet on a municipal tap.
That's right. Famously, Aquafina and Dasani are both municipal water sources that then go through a consistent treatment process that's the same everywhere in the world, right? And that actually includes, I believe, filtering the water very, very stringently, and then re-adding a handful of minerals that give it a mineral water taste.
Yeah, which is, I mean, it's bizarre if you think about it for only a couple of seconds, right?
Yeah.
And I think that the industrial design of these bottles really reflects the kind of commercial moment that we're looking at as well, where this Aquafina bottle, I mean, say what you will about Coke, but their bottles are iconic, right? Mm-hmm. They've been making these bottles for a really long time with this same shape, and it has a romantic feel that is, manufactured by a corporation that sells sugar water, mm-hmm. but it still has that romance kind of in it somewhere. But then these companies start making bottled water, and I think the Aquafina bottle is so uninspired as a design object. Now, it actually does represent kind of big advances in a marketing company, and they kind of figure out how to make zillions of these things, which they were probably not going to be able to do with plastic soda bottles.
Well, when I look at the Aquafina bottle, what stands out to me is that it resembles a Pepsi bottle a lot. It kind of does. And I think that says something about how Aquafina was introduced into the Pepsi distribution system, right? Because this is a bottled water that has a pentalobe base. And as you pointed out a moment ago with your Evian bottle, bottled water is not under anywhere near as much pressure as a cola or any sparkling beverage. So aspects of this design are kind of superfluous in a bottled water, but this is a bottle that has to be acquired and filled by the same Pepsi regional bottling companies as Pepsi itself, and so it looks like they've really optimized for a bottle design that very, very closely resembles a Pepsi bottle.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, and it does have the kind of swirl shapes around its top edge, right? Which which, yeah, are evoking something kind of early 20th century soda fountain in some way, right? I will note that, I don't know if Aquafina does this, but many bottled water bottlers dose their bottles with liquid nitrogen. So you fill them up, with some headspace with water, and then you add a droplet of liquid nitrogen into the bottle, which then expands into a gas and creates some internal pressure on the bottle before the bottle is capped. And so the headspace up there will be nitrogen gas rather than air. And the result is that you actually do have a little bit of pressure on the walls of the bottle, but you're doing that not for kind of the effervescent feeling that the consumer is going to have. It's not for the mouthfeel. No, it's just for the structural properties of the bottle, right? Where you want this thing to be kind of inflated a little bit like a balloon, because it's going to be much stronger under compression when you stack, 10 cartons of these things high. The internal pressure is going to help the bottom bottles not collapse.
Right. And this is important when we move on from this Aquafina bottle, which has walls that feel like they're about as thick as a typical 20-ounce soda bottle. And take a look at this Niagara bottle, which is vastly lighter. And I think this is typical of a lot of the lower cost or private label bottled water that you'd find at a lot of retail locations today. It's just featherweight.
Yeah, it's kind of an amazing product. I mean, it feels to me a little bit like a balloon, honestly, right? And
yeah, exactly. And it's like at risk of disappearing in my hands at any time. So something like this needs to be filled in order not to be crushed.
Exactly. Yeah. I was not previously aware of the Niagara Bottling Company, partly because they mostly don't bottle with Niagara on the label, right? They mostly bottle for brands like, Walgreens has their Nice brand, Costco has Kirkland, Albertson has Signature something, and Niagara is a company that mostly deals with white label brands like those, house brands. They're, I would say, to me, a surprisingly large company. They have, somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 employees. I think they have like a dozen bottling locations across the country. And they are obviously very proud of the advances, if we will call them those, that their bottle manufacturing team or engineering team have made.
They're notable for having a very large and sophisticated design and engineering team. A lot of bottlers are not really doing their own design and engineering. They're just sort of like buying off the shelf machinery and sourcing bottles from other places and filling them. But Niagara does take a lot of pride in the scale of its engineering operation and the R&D that goes on there. So when we look at this bottle, what are we seeing? What are the advancements that are in this?
Well, mostly it's just extremely light, right? I mean, they have reduced the walls to something like it's under 0.2 of a millimeter, I believe, right? This is really, really thin plastic. The cap height is very short. They're compensating for all these things by changing the physical shape of the bottle such that it can be really thin without, like you said, kind of collapsing in your hand. And so you have all these ridges down the side of the thing that allow this thing to be very light while retaining some structure.
That's right. The height of the cap is the first thing that I remember noticing in kind of the evolution of these bottles. I mean, this is a cap that has perhaps 3 threads, is less than half the height of the Aquafina cap that it's next to. So all in all, an enormous reduction in plastic usage in each of these bottles.
Right, which would be, I mean, the cap height would be an annoyance if you expected the consumer to remove the cap, reinstall the cap, remove the cap, reinstall the cap, so on and so forth. But I mean, when I buy a 0.5 liter bottle of water like this, it's in my hand for about 45 seconds before I throw it away, right? It's such a short experience. You uncap it and you can basically throw the cap away right then. You chug the contents and then you toss the bottle.
That's an interesting point. They're like different degrees of single use, right? If you have a 20-ounce Pepsi bottle, you might be drinking that for 45 minutes or something in the car and putting the cap back on after each sip. A single-use water bottle is probably an even more single-use package than that.
Yeah. And it can be a little difficult to align those threads back up to tighten the cap back on.
Yeah.
Yeah, I find it really remarkable. I mean, to me, the most impressive thing, they sell these bottles in something like 32 bottle packs, right? And so, you have whatever, like 8x4 of these things. They're kind of stacked together, and then they're just shrink wrapped in plastic there's no cardboard in the carton usually. And so the entire container is plastic. And then you take these things and you stack them chest high, and so there's a ton of weight there. And they act as they're almost like Lego bricks or something like that. Like they really do kind of stick together and retain their shape just until you slice the packaging open and open the cap, and then all of a sudden this thing it's just like a balloon that you are emptying into your mouth.
Yeah, and any further over-engineering would be wasteful in this case. It would be a waste of plastic. Maybe. It's like perfectly tuned. And I love the way that they get rigidity from being sort of bundled together as well. It's a really cool design feature.
Yeah. If you're selling them in bulk, then why wouldn't you do that, right? It's really, really clever.
So we're looking at 5 bottles here that represent the evolution of the plastic bottle. Spencer, do you have a sense of what's next in the world of plastic bottles? What are the concept cars of plastic bottles that people are showing at the big trade shows and so on, look like today?
I'm not sure exactly what these companies would say is the future. I know, there is a lot of work on boxed water, and I think that that brand boxed water is better, right? Mm-hmm. They are putting it right in their name, right on their packaging, and I think there are some real advantages to that, namely in terms of packing efficiency,
because those can be rectangular prisms, so you can fit more in a truck.
Exactly. Now there are some drawbacks to that, right? It turns out that the way these things are shipped in trucks, oftentimes you will reach the load capacity of the truck in terms of mass before you have filled the volume of the truck itself, right? Mm-hmm. Which is to say that your packing efficiency might not actually matter, right? You just can't carry that much water in a truck because water's kind of heavy.
Not a bad idea to ship water in pipes, as it turns out.
Right, exactly. There's really some real benefits to plumbing, right? So I don't know. Maybe you have some clever system where you are, packaging all your water in Tetra Paks or some kind of box, some prism container, and then you can get the truck 3 feet high in water, and then you're putting potato chips on top of that or something like that. But I don't really know if our logistical systems are that intelligent, honestly, right?
The other thing that stands out as the kind of future of water, which comes more from the branding side, is canned water, right? Liquid Death canned water has been an exceptionally successful brand over just the last few years. I think that has more to do with the realization that at concerts and events and so on, people who are drinking water kind of want to look like they're and feel like they're drinking a more fun drink than water. So you put it in a can and it looks like a tall boy of beer. But I'm curious if we'll see more canned water as well.
Yeah, me too. And I'm conflicted about this. I mean, you can't not be concerned about plastics in some way, right? I mean, there's plenty of evidence that, it wasn't just the acrylonitrile plastic bottles that were hurting people. These other products are also, not great for the environment and probably not great for us. Mm-hmm. Now, it turns out aluminum mining is like a really wasteful process as well. Making aluminum out of bauxite, it consumes huge amounts of energy, right, in particular. And it's not like the recycling rates for aluminum cans are that impressive compared to plastic bottles. Mm-hmm. So, ultimately, it turns out that societies don't make decisions based on, what is most ecologically or public health minded, right? We make personal decisions for reasons like I want to look cool at a concert, right? And predicting those kind of things is pretty tricky.
All right, so this is our evolution of the plastic bottle and perhaps a peek at its future as well. Spencer, for those who don't know scope of work, tell us a little bit about what it is that you do.
So I write a weekly newsletter. It's kind of nominally about engineering and manufacturing and infrastructure. But it's also kind of about how you structure your work, right? And how we should think of work in the context of our broader lives. And so, sometimes that means looking at a product like a plastic bottle or, silica gel or, a helicopter rotor or something like that. But it also kind of means, thinking about how our work fits into the rest of our lives and how we kind of think about our legacy, I guess. I don't know. I'm a 42-year-old guy with kids, right? So I write what I know, I guess.
Well, I really enjoy your deep dives into these kinds of things. A scope of work is a great reminder that the world is much more complex than you often expect, and that a lot of thought goes into the way that things are made, which is something that I always enjoy going through.
Yeah.
In closing, I'd like to ask you a question that we ask all of our guests. Can you tell us about a go, no-go moment that you've faced and what you decided to do?
I'm sitting right in front of a bike that I built that completely failed a couple of weeks ago. So I built this steel bike frame 12 or 13 years ago, something like that. And have ridden it hard enough in the meantime to fully crack the down tube and seat tube on this bike. And this is not the first crack in a bicycle frame that I have encountered. And it was a kind of pleasantly easy to diagnose, right? I was riding along and I could totally feel that my bike was moving in a way that it was not supposed to. In this case, this bike is basically going to be trashed, right? It's going to be disassembled and rebuilt in some fashion into something else. But it's made me think a lot about kind of the things in my life that are worth repairing and the things that aren't. It would not be impossible to repair this frame. But also, it's good to know when to let go of things. It can be destructive, ultimately, to try to repair something beyond its useful life. And I think it is a sign of maturity that we kind of let things go sometimes and accept that something that we've invested a lot in is no longer worth having as part of our lives.
Do you have an end of life plan for your bike frame? Are you going to turn it into a planter or melt it down and forge it into a sculpture or something?
I'm not sure if this is something I'm proud of or ashamed of, but I have actually a whole wall over there of bikes that I've built and ridden and then eventually retired.
Cracked while riding down the BQE on a bike.
Yeah, exactly. It's, I do think that it's good, at least to some extent, to keep these things around us still, even if we're not able to use them anymore, because it reminds you of both the good work that you put into it and also your good decision to let go of it at some point.
Excellent. Well, Spencer Wright, it's been a pleasure to talk to you today. Check out the essay that Spencer wrote on the evolution of the plastic bottle that's on First Article, and check out Scope of Work as well for a weekly newsletter on how things are made and the stories behind the built objects in the world. Spencer, thanks so much.
John, thank you.
Moving on now to headlines, where we talk about recent developments in the world of product development and manufacturing. To do that, I'm joined by my colleague, Alex Howe. Great to see you, Alex.
Hi, John.
So what do we have?
So the first headline I have today comes from the Financial Times. Boeing has completed a $4.7 billion purchase of Spirit, which paves the way for an Airbus supplier deal.
So Spirit was initially spun out of Boeing back in 2005. It makes a lot of the airframe components of Boeing's commercial airplanes. Why is it significant recently?
Yeah, so there was that very famous incident in January 2024 where Alaska Airlines had a door blowout. Luckily, no one was harmed in that incident, but it could have been extremely dangerous. And that was chalked up to a manufacturing error by Spirit. So pretty shortly after, like just a couple of months after, Boeing started seriously investigating, bringing Spirit back into the fold.
Yeah, this is an example of an OEM, in this case Boeing, that's pushed more of its product development and large-scale manufacturing work onto its Tier 1 suppliers. This was work that used to be done in-house at Boeing before they spun out Spirit AeroSystems in 2005, but now they have a relationship with Spirit that's similar to what you'd see in like an automotive OEM and its relationship with a Tier 1 automotive supplier. It definitely creates a different relationship between the engineering teams that are working on different components of the aircraft than it does when they're working at the same company and they're all part of the OEM. And that's led to some concerns that this structure might create incentives for cutting corners or perhaps not spending on safety where they should.
Right. Like the idea of spinning a company out, right, is that then it forces it to be more efficient in order to survive, right, to seek other business, to adapt, maybe adopt new technologies faster. But at the same time, that is a lot of pressure on a company that has a smaller safety net, and that can lead to things falling through the cracks.
That's right. The big question has been whether Boeing would bail out Spirit. It's a critical part of Boeing's supply chain, and it's actually a critical part of Airbus's supply chain too.
Yeah, so Airbus gets parts out of Spirit from all over the world, from France, Morocco, Kansas, North Carolina. So that's where also they had a lot of concerns, probably about their own quality as well. But if Boeing were to take Spirit back, like how can they easily replace that? So this agreement allows them to retain ownership of that.
Yeah, you've highlighted an interesting thing. You tend to think about Boeing as the American aircraft manufacturer and Airbus as the European aircraft manufacturer, and they're constantly in this like geopolitical conflict. But a lot of Airbus's supply chain is in the U.S., just as a lot of Boeing's supply chain is outside of the U.S. The estimate is about 26% of Airbus's global spending on external suppliers is in the U.S., and 11% of their suppliers are based in the U.S. They get a lot of really high-value components, including aircraft engines from U.S. manufacturers, and they do quite a bit of aircraft assembly in the southeastern U.S., in Alabama and North Carolina. So it's a very blended global supply chain for these companies.
It's super interesting. I had no idea until I read this article. The other thing I was surprised to learn about was that Northern Ireland has a really thriving aerospace industry. So like a big benefit of this deal is that it preserves the historic Short Brothers factories in Belfast.
Whoa, Short Brothers. That is an old name. When I was a kid growing up in Virginia, I used to sometimes fly on, I believe it was the Short 360, which is a sort of a goofy square commuter plane. We'll put a link to it in the show notes if you want to see it.
So staying with our theme of transportation, Ryan Felton and Paul Overberg at the Wall Street Journal recently did a really fascinating investigation into airbag recalls. So even though millions of defective airbags have been recalled, they're still not fixed. From 2015 to 2024, 12 million vehicles were recalled for airbag deployment defects, but about 22% of them remain unfixed and on the road, and this has led to several casualties.
What keeps them from getting fixed?
Ultimately, it's people not bringing them into the dealer. So, the companies, they have a legal obligation to notify consumers of the dangers and to offer, right, the free repair. But actually, customers, they ultimately have a choice as to whether or not they want to be bothered with handling it. So I was pretty surprised to hear this, but there's even an example that with the famous Takata airbag recall that happened several years ago, customers would even write to the companies asking to stop receiving the recall notices.
So it's the consumer's fault. They hit unsubscribe.
Exactly. Some reasons for this might be that, all recalls are maybe communicated at the same level. So maybe consumers have trouble understanding the severity of different types of instances. But it seems that regardless what the fix is, like even if it's a serious flaw, like failing brakes or engine fires, or like a minor flaw, like a seatbelt buckle issue, roughly 1 in 3 people don't take their car to be fixed for the recall.
I think you made an interesting point about how all recalls are communicated at about the same level of severity. And I've never been subject to an automotive recall, but I've gotten notices about a handful of consumer recalls, and it really is hard to know how important it is. A lot of like home products, for instance, will get recalled because the size of an opening is in the danger zone of dimensions for like having children around it. A kid could get their head stuck in it. If you're not worried about that, given the demographics of your home, then maybe it doesn't matter that you send this product back in and get it replaced. And then there are other recalls where it's like an explosion hazard. But either way, you get a series of sort of legalistic emails from the retailer encouraging you to go through a lengthy process on kind of a backward website to initiate your recall. And it is hard to know how important it is to do that and to overcome the activation energy required to fill out the form and bring the thing to the post office and, wait 6 weeks for your replacement part.
Yeah, I used to drive a 2012 Kia, and I would always take my car for service every year because I have a very deep fear of my car breaking down on the side of the road. So I'm very diligent about car service. And so actually my car experienced a lot of recalls, but normally I'm like, oh, I'll just handle it at my annual service. And over time it's dawned on me, many of my friends actually don't take their cars for annual service. And so it's probably more of like a inconvenience. There's not a cadence where that might fit into their daily lives.
Right. Exactly. I think you have good instincts for wanting to get your car serviced.
So you've never had like a recall on your car? I must have had like 3 or 4 in the few years I was driving the Kia.
Well, I drive a Honda and it's an outstanding car. But probably I have been, and I've not noticed them. And when I bring it in to get it serviced, they just check automatically and it gets fixed. All right, let's turn our attention now to the power generation grid. This is a topic of a lot of conversation given the demand placed on the grid in the US, especially by AI data centers.
Yes, so the Financial Times is a really interesting article about the power crunch threatening America's AI ambitions. So in 2026, about 5 data centers are estimated to come online that will each draw at least 1 gigawatt of energy, and that's equivalent to the output of a nuclear reactor.
That's insane. Yeah, the largest power plant in the U.S. is the Grand Coulee Dam in Washington State, and it produces a nameplate capacity of something like 7 gigawatts. So this is 1/7 of the largest power plant in the U.S. of the like theoretical nameplate capacity of the largest power plant in the U.S. in a single data center.
And of course, we see a lot of efforts to build even more data centers. So right now, 51 gigawatts is the capacity across the U.S. required by data centers, and that's 5% of the United States peak demand. By 2028, it's estimated an additional 44 gigawatts will be needed, but there's a 40% gap there between what is estimated to be needed for the data centers and what the grid is expected to be able to support.
So how are the data center operators approaching this?
They have a few angles they're going in with. So they're approaching grid operators to really encourage them to develop new capacity, right? Trying to get bids and maybe identify where they're going to build the data centers, kind of optimizing for expected power needs and distributing that. They're also looking more to like on-site power generation. For example, XAI has facilities that have gas turbine generators, nominally as backup, although local residents have complained that they have more turbines than they said they do and that they're running all the time, which is poisoning the air.
The interesting thing about the U.S. electrical grid is that as more renewables have gone onto the grid and they have very variable output, the way that utilities have balanced them is by building a lot more of these like small scale gas turbine, they're called peaking power plants because they can be switched on very quickly when there's a peak load. And it sounds like exactly what these companies are doing. So the mix of power that they're getting at their data center is maybe not actually that different from what they would get from the grid, but it's just generated on site.
Right, and there's like a political angle there too, right, where renewables are maybe being discouraged, like it should all be coal, and then you need even more power, so even more coal, and it also like limits the scalability, right, if there aren't the incentives to like build that kind of renewable infrastructure.
There are a couple other interesting details here. One is that something I've been following a little bit this year, Microsoft has signed an agreement with the owner of the infamous 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant in Pennsylvania to restart one of its reactors and provide a dedicated source of power to a big data center that it's operating. The other thing that this article mentions is that it's very difficult to know what the actual demand for power is several years off into the future, because large consumers of power, as well as power plant developers submit these interconnection applications to grid operators saying we want to, bring a new power plant online and connect it to the grid. And it takes so long for those applications to get through, up to 8 years in the case of Northern Virginia, where there are a lot of these AI data centers, that developers of both data centers and power plants tend to put in a lot of applications with multiple grid operators just to sort of like see how far they can move along. And so a single, basis of demand, a single AI data center might actually be the subject of half a dozen different grid interconnection applications. When you add all of those applications up, it's a ton of power, but only one is actually going to get built. It's just that it takes 8 years for it to move through the queue. You see the same thing in San Francisco planning applications. A lot of developers will submit plans to the city, and then their entire value add is that they're just sitting there and moving the plan through the planning queue. And then as soon as it gets approved, they sell the entitlement to build it to a different developer who can actually execute it. But there's value in just kind of like sitting on that egg in the nest while it moves through the process.
Getting the approval.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Something that people often don't think about too, you think about like the chips or the NVIDIA GPUs and how much power they draw. But there's actually so many other electronics in the data center that all consume power. So in my previous role, I was working on transceivers. Mm-hmm. And these are like active components that basically move the data from like maybe rack to rack or data center to data center, right? There's different types of transceiver that have these like really impenetrable names that were not developed by a marketer. Because you have like short range for short, you have SR for short range, LR for long range, ER for like longer range, and ZR for even longer range. You're like, what do they mean? Why are they like that?
The letter Z is not an even longer range.
Right. But you think about it, like one rack has like countless ports and every single port has something plugged into it that also consume power. And then it consumes more power at the other end. And you can distribute your data centers by having like longer interconnects, but then those need more power to like cover the distance. And there's this very interesting game at like every single level of every single component that goes into the data center because they're all contributing to that enormous power draw.
Interesting. And then you put it in a place like Texas and you also have to air condition the place.
Yeah.
A lot of power usage. You've pulled out another article here about power delivery as well around electric batteries on the grid.
Yeah, so there's a New York Times piece that has really beautiful, beautiful photos. So I highly recommend everyone checks out the link and sees them for themselves. But it's called Once a Gamble in the Desert, Electric Grid Batteries Are Everywhere. So we were talking a little bit about renewables like wind and solar, right? And historically, those are known for being really peaky, right? Like when the sun is up and it's hot, you have a lot of energy. But then as soon as the sun sets, there's a lull and you need backup power. But the implementation of large-scale lithium-ion battery grids is allowing states to really stabilize that demand.
Yeah, this is really the key to making renewables work. As I mentioned earlier, if you don't have energy storage, you need to have other probably fossil fuel power plants that can complement your renewable energy sources so you can switch them on. In practice, that's almost entirely natural gas with these like small gas turbine power plants. So if you can shift everything to batteries, you can smooth this out a lot and seriously reduce your demand for fossil fuels. Of course, you still need to overbuild your solar capacity very dramatically if you hope to have a grid that's powered entirely by solar, because you'll still have, strings of cloudy days, or in the wintertime, if you're not close to the equator, there's a lot less sunlight per day. So supplying all of like California's energy needs on solar is much, much harder in the winter than it is in the summertime. And there have actually been a few points in the last couple of summers when California has been on balance, more than 100% renewable supplied instantaneously.
That's awesome. That's really great news for the environment.
Yeah, absolutely. Encouraging story.
Yeah. Something I learned was that the first use of batteries in a grid was 15 years ago in a desert in Chile. And that was like the first proof point. Since then, the cost of these batteries has dropped 90%. So that's what's allowing large scale adoption in places like California.
Interesting. Same thing that's powering our consumer electronics.
One concern people have about these battery installations is something we have near and dear to our hearts, which is battery fires.
That's right. Lithium-ion batteries, famously dangerous.
Yeah. And there was a really high-profile fire not that far away in Monterey County that burned down, I think, 75% of the facility. And that released a lot of toxic fumes. Like, I think over 1,000 residents had to be evacuated. And that has been speaking to some of the fears people have about these implementations. But something to note about that fire is that the Monterey facility used a type of chemistry that isn't really widely used anymore. It was more of like an older, more original battery storage facility. It was also all installed indoors inside the power plant building. So today, and you see this in the photos from the New York Times, most of these grids are installed outdoors and they're spread out so that if one does catch fire, it won't so easily like catch through the entire array.
Right. Long term, the hope is that some entirely new chemistries could be developed that would be attractive for grid scale energy storage. They might not work for consumer electronics because you can imagine that there are battery formulations that would be very heavy or very bulky. But if you're building them out in the middle of the desert, that doesn't matter so much. And instead, what you want is inexpensive, bulk capacity, as well as, low risk of fire, really good reliability. So there's some chemistries that are being developed that use iron and sulfur and even molten salt that could help with energy storage and not rely on the lithium-ion based chemistries.
So the last article I want to talk about, I think, is pretty apt for this season of holiday shopping and subsequent maybe holiday returns.
My favorite season is the holiday return season.
But Anne-Marie Conti at Wirecutter did a really interesting investigation where she and the team bought a 450-pound mystery pallet of returned goods that came from Amazon as well as other sources. And they basically took apart all the packages to find out what was inside and figure out like why they were there and what the secondary and return market looks like.
So I've always had this naive hope that when I return something to Amazon, a very careful worker in a distribution center will be opening the box, inspecting the packaging, rehabbing whatever needs to be refurbished, and then putting it back on the shelf to sell. But that's not what's going on here.
Yeah, something Anne-Marie noticed that she was surprised by was that many of the packages in her pallet were unopened, so they hadn't been processed when they were shipped back. Part of that might just be the volume of returns that companies see. So an estimated 15.8% of sales worth $850 billion will be returned in 2025. And as of June, 25% of e-commerce clothing purchases were returned.
This highlights an area that's very challenging for online retailers in particular, which is what they call the reverse supply chain. Supply chains are built to distribute products to consumers, and it's often a little bit of an afterthought to return the products from consumers back to the retailer. It really defies automation. It remains a very manual process, right? Because it's a little bit easier to automate the original supply chain. If you look at an Amazon warehouse where you have these Kiva robots and box building machines and everything is just flowing through because Amazon can be sure that its packaging sizes are totally standard, that everything is being done in controlled conditions. But when these packages get returned by consumers, they could be in any condition. They might be in a different box entirely than the one it was shipped in. The box might be damaged. Other aspects of the packaging might be damaged. So it's much, much harder to automate that. And as a result, it's not cost effective for Amazon to actually open a lot of these packages. They know what's in them, what's been returned, and you might as well just sort of sell it in bulk to a liquidator.
Right. Everything about processing returns costs them money. Even the act of throwing it away costs a big company money, right? To have someone come and dispose of it appropriately. So the pathways for these returns are either they get donated, they go back to the manufacturer, or they end up at these resellers. So that could be the massive liquidators like Anne-Marie Conti visited. It could be Dollar General, TJ Maxx, flea markets, independent shops that are online or in person. There's a whole ecosystem of reselling.
Well, I was glad to see Anne-Marie Conti's name on this article as well, because we've actually done a little bit of work with Anne-Marie at Lumafield. We CT scanned a handful of Ralph Nader's favorite pens in order to help her investigate why he might be dissatisfied with their writing performance.
I don't think that must have been before I joined. What is so special about these pens?
Ralph Nader's been using the same Papermate felt-tipped pen for decades, and he's recently felt like it doesn't write as well as it used to. So she hunted down everything that could explain its diminishing performance, and the tests were a little inconclusive. The one that we were hunting down with CT scans was the theory that they've used different materials in composing the pens, or maybe that there's less ink in them. There didn't appear to be a difference in ink, but we did notice that they've substituted some of the invisible, non-cosmetic plastics for recyclable plastics. Recycled plastic can stand out in a CT scan because you can notice the regrind, the distribution of slightly different plastic particles that have been ground up from probably pre-consumer waste and melted back down and put through the injection molding machine again. Anyway, that was the only thing that we really found in Ralph Nader's pens that could explain any difference in performance. And probably an admirable one. You do want to see more recycled plastics being used in products like that. We'll link to both of these Wirecutter articles by Anne-Marie Conti in the show notes attached to this episode. And if listeners would like to send us interesting headlines for us to discuss on the show, just email gng@lumafield.com. GNG as in go, no, go @lumafield.com. And speaking of changes to plastics and packaging, let's move on to the Reconstructions segment of our podcast, where we talk about the history of something interesting that happened in the world of manufacturing and product development. What do we have?
So today we're going to take a little bit of a maybe true crime meets manufacturing detour. We're going to talk about the Tylenol murders.
Famous case.
Yes. So this happened back in 1982 in Chicago. So in late September 1982, 7 people around Chicago died after taking extra strength Tylenol capsules that had been laced with potassium cyanide. And so what we have here, actually, this is a 80s bottle of Tylenol. So it's a little bit different than what was used in the Tylenol murders. There were kind of a couple elements that made that product vulnerable. The first was, as you see here, there's no like child-proof or tamper-proof packaging. There's no seal. So at this time in the 80s, there were child-proof packages. There had been issues with children overdosing on aspirin, but because Tylenol didn't contain aspirin, it wasn't required to have any child-proof. So you can see, you can just screw and unscrew that one.
Yeah. It's almost shocking to hold a pill bottle that doesn't have a child-proof cap on it.
That's not a struggle.
Yeah, that's right. Easiest pill bottle I've ever opened.
Then you see this little bit of cotton, and then right in there, the pills are loose. So in the bottle we have, these are pressed tablets, but the pills in the Tylenol murders, these were gel capsules that were filled with powder.
Those are the type that separate into 2 parts, and then they're full of a powder inside. Exactly.
And they were really popular at the time because they were pretty smooth, so they were seen as easy to swallow. So unfortunately, someone had, presumably taken these packages off of the store shelves, opened up some of those capsules and replaced them with potassium cyanide, put them back, and then placed them back in the store. And another thing to note is like today, a lot of boxes you buy of medication, those boxes are maybe wrapped in clear plastic or they're taped, but the boxes at the time, they had no glue or any other indicator that they had been tampered with.
So they were just loose cardboard boxes and you can stick your thumb in and open it up.
Exactly. So there was no way for anyone to know that the pills had been tampered with.
Did investigators figure out who did it?
So investigators spent a lot of time trying to figure out who did it, right? They spent a lot of time with J&J as well as McNeil, which was the subsidiary that was manufacturing Tylenol, because there was also concern, right? Was this something from the manufacturing process or was this tampering? So J&J immediately issued a really wide recall. They even had people going door to door in Chicago, right? Telling people not to take the Tylenol that they had purchased and taking it all back. And ultimately, I think all of those pills were destroyed. Investigators did note that J&J's factories did in fact have some cyanide in them. They were using it for quality control for testing, but this was some distance from the manufacturing line, and it was also a different composition of cyanide than that was found in the pills ultimately. Interesting.
So very unlikely to have been a manufacturing defect, almost certainly a criminal intervention.
Yes, exactly. And so they had several different suspects. For example, James W. Lewis, he sent an extortion letter for $1 million claiming responsibility. Ultimately, he was convicted of extortion. He said he'd wanted to get revenge on J&J because he attributed the loss of his daughter to manufacturing error from J&J for a different product. But there was never any physical evidence at time to actually doing the poisoning. So he spent some time in jail for extortion, and then he recently passed away in 2023.
What was the quantifiable business impact of this tragedy on Johnson & Johnson?
Well, so this was the first real mass recall in American history. So 31 million bottles of Tylenol were recalled.
Wow.
And Johnson & Johnson was really lauded for their response, right? Because they didn't know why the Tylenol was dangerous, right? Was it a manufacturing defect? Was it contamination? But they really erred on the side of caution and recalled more rather than less, right? At a great expense. It cost them, I think, over $100 million at the time, which would be over $300 million today.
So excellent public relations management on J&J's part, and they were seen as having acted with integrity.
Yes, so they had initially had 35% market share of the U.S. pain reliever market, and immediately after the murders, right, that completely collapsed down to 8%. But within a year, they had regained roughly 30% market share, and it's really a super famous case study, and all these MBA programs on how to effectively manage crises like this.
It's kind of a counterpart to the famous New Coke introduction story where Coca-Cola introduced the New Coke, which was very, very unpopular. And then upon canceling it and reintroducing Coca-Cola Classic, it made Coca-Cola Classic even more popular because they had kind of taken it away and given people a moment to reflect on how much they actually loved it. And that's caused some speculation that the introduction of New Coke was a very sophisticated marketing ploy to reinforce support for Coca-Cola Classic. Obviously not what's going on with Johnson & Johnson here, but both are great examples of consumer marketing that overcomes a challenge and actually manages to turn it into something positive.
Yeah, we also saw really significant changes in their packaging. So tamper-proofing hadn't been a thing, as is obvious by this bottle we were looking at earlier. But 43 days after the first Tylenol deaths, they revealed their triple seal tamper-resistant packaging. And this involved 3 layers. There was a glued and sealed outer box. So first step, right? If someone's opened the box to get to the bottle, you could see that. There was a shrink band over the bottle neck. And then there was a foil seal over the bottle mouth. The other thing that really changed as a result of these murders was a transition away from capsules for over-the-counter medications. Now you can still get those, of course, if your pharmacy is blending something for you specifically. But now you find the majority of pills are solid caplets, which are significantly harder to tamper with.
This is the first time I put together that the caplet was introduced as a pill form factor following this tragedy, right? It is a tablet, a pressed powder tablet in the shape of a capsule, which most people found easier to swallow. And so it's a caplet. I had never put that together before.
The other thing that changed was that the government passed some regulations. So Johnson & Johnson clearly took really strong initiative in proactively addressing safety concerns and tampering concerns as a result of the murders. The law and the government were a little bit slower to follow. 1 year later, in 1983, there was the Federal Anti-Tampering Act, which made tampering a federal crime with severe penalties. And then 7 years later, in 1989, the FDA finally mandated tamper-evident packaging for over-the-counter medications. So that's why even in like generic ibuprofen like this from Signature Care, right, you've got your seal here now.
And this is the ubiquitous experience when we deal with pill bottles today. Child-proof cap, a lot of sealing on it, and as you mentioned, a glued cardboard box around the outside as well. And that brings us to the end of this episode of Go No Go. Go No Go is brought to you by Lumafield, whose industrial CT scanners and analysis software help engineering teams work faster and deliver great products. You can learn more at lumafield.com. You can find links to everything we talked about today in the show notes attached to this episode of the podcast. We publish this podcast on both YouTube and Spotify as video podcasts, so you can see us and see the things that we're holding. And of course, it's distributed everywhere else as an audio podcast. We really appreciate it when a lot of you have left really positive reviews on the podcast platforms. We really appreciate that, and it helps the podcast find its way to people who might enjoy it. In our next episode of Go No Go, we're going to be talking with Shahram Mokhtari, who's the lead teardown wizard at iFixit. He's going to tell us what it takes to take a piece of electronics apart and to really read what's going on inside. For Go No Go, I'm Jon Bruner.
And I'm Alex Howe.
Go No Go is brought to you by Lumafield, which was founded to upgrade manufacturing. You can learn more at lumafield.com. Go No Go is produced by Austin Carter and edited by Brian Tran, with additional assistance from Eric Petralia.